From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome. I'm Diana Ingram. I'm the executive director here at Hill Center at the Old Naval Hospital, and I see many familiar faces, but I always like to ask who has never been in the building before. If you'd rate, oh, welcome, welcome, good. Come back. Take a look at all of the information that's on your seats and check out our website, and do take a moment on your way out to enjoy our beautiful art galleries. It's contemporary art from regional artists, and it's a particularly lovely exhibit this time. This is the third edition of the Hill Center Poetry Series, featuring the ever passionate and lyrical Carl Phillips in conversation with Ron Charles of the Washington Post. This is a unique collaboration among the Hill Center, the Library of Congress's Poetry and Literature Center, and our media sponsor, the Washington Post. Many thanks to all of our collaborators, especially National Capital Bank, whose generosity makes this program possible. And also a quick thank you to Marianne Brownlow, who's standing in the back and is in fact the fairy godmother of the poetry series. So thank you, Marianne. The format, Ron and Carl will be in conversation, and directly following that, there will be a reception across the hall with artisanal cheeses and some lovely wine and sparkling water and maybe some pop for those who like pop. Now, and Mr. Phillips' books are available for sale in the hall, and following the conversation, he will also be in the John Phillips Sousa Hall and will sign books. He's graciously agreed to do that, so super. Let me welcome Rob Casper, head of the Library of Congress's Poetry and Literature Center. He's also the programs director for the Poetry Society of America. He has served as the membership director for the Council of Literary Magazines and Presses, and 10 years ago, little Rob Casper founded the literary magazine, or Jubilat, which publishes the best of contemporary American poetry. Welcome, Rob.
Thanks so much, Diana. And I want to also thank Marianne for making this series possible. And thanks to all of you for being out tonight. This is a terrific crowd. We hope you come back to our future events in this series. I just want to say a few words about the Poetry and Literature Center at the Library of Congress. We are home to the Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry, which is the only federally funded position for literary artists in the country. We also put on programs like this one here, but also programs at the library's home just a few blocks up the street. We have a sign-up sheet outside if you want to sign up, and also a sheet with our information on our upcoming programs. I think we have 2 more programs this fall or this spring in this series with Ed Hirsch, and who's the other person we have? August Kleinzall. Actually, he's coming in the fall, and Mary Zebis. Both are coming in the fall. So a terrific lineup of poets who will be up here talking with Ron. I did want to say something about the new title we have for this series, which is called The Life of a Poet. We came up with this title after the second event, which happened in October, featuring Nick Flynn. And I think it more accurately captures the magic you are about to witness, as Ron Charles, fiction editor of the Washington Post, and one of the district's and nation's patron saints of literature, covers the career of our featured poet. I'll say a little bit about our featured poet tonight. Carl Phillips is the author of 12 books of poems, a lot for Ron to read in preparation for tonight. His most recent books are Silver Chest and Double Shadow, which won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. He has also written a book of prose, Coin of the Realm, essays on the life and art of poetry, and is the translator of Sophocles' Philoctetes. His honors include the Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award, the Theodore Roethke Memorial Poetry Award, the Lambda Book Award, the Tom Gunn Award for Gay Male Poetry, and awards and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and the Academy of American Poets. In 1998, then poet laureate, consultant in poetry, Robert Pinsky selected Phillips as one of the Library of Congress's inaugural Widder-Binner Fellows. So he's had a long connection with our office and with the library. Excuse me. Phillips was a chancellor of the Academy of American Poets from 2006 to 2012 and currently serves as the judge for the Yale series of younger poets. He lives in St. Louis, where he is professor of English at Washington University. In 2001, Nick Flynn, our featured poet for the series last October, interviewed our featured poet tonight, Carl Phillips, for Bomb Magazine and asked, quote, "What is the relationship between what is known and what is unknowable?" Carl's response, which ends with the following, shows what's at stake in his work and where I'll bet the conversation will go tonight. He said then, quote, "For me, there's an urge to push at ideas with which I've become comfortable and to keep testing what others might prefer to leave alone. How else do we grow as writers and as people?" End quote. Please join me in welcoming Carl Phillips.
Thank you all so much for coming. This is a treat for me. It's a real honor to be here, and I appreciate you showing up. We designed this to be a full hour of conversation about poetry. We would just sink in, talk to a poet about his or her life and about his or her poems. There won't be any questions at the end, but instead, you can all go across the hall and ask questions yourselves. So it's pretty intense. I mean, it's not Quaker Meeting House intense, but it's pretty intense. So just sit back and enjoy, and let's see where this goes, okay? Mike's okay? Okay, good. Okay, all right. And thank you so much for coming. I'm really
Thank you for having me.
Delighted.
Everyone.
Let's start by talking about who you are. You grew up in a military family, right?
Yes.
What was that like for a poet?
Confining?
Confining? But you moved all the time, right?
Yeah, but confining in terms of mentality, I think. There's something about living on an Air Force base where the newspaper is the Stars and Stripes.
Yes.
Maybe it's different now, but that was the one newspaper. And there's a tendency not to leave, sort of like those big subdivisions now, but they didn't have those then. So you're always on the base, school's there, stores are there, and I think it's easy for thinking to be very programmed.
You're born in the late 50s, right? 59?
Yes.
You missed the civil rights. I mean, the civil rights movement didn't have an effect on your life as a child.
No, not really.
And the Stonewall riots, no.
No,
Nothing.
no. Although, I mean, with civil rights, I was certainly aware that my parents, I mean, they're a biracial couple, and so I was aware that there were places we couldn't be stationed, for example, because of their, like, my father had to be stationed in Texas, and my mother and my sisters and I had to stay in Oregon. I think that's where we were because there couldn't be a mixed family on the base at that time, like in 63 or 64 or something like that. So there are ways in which I was aware, but I wasn't,
Right.
my parents weren't protesting or anything.
Right. What gave you the impression you could be a poet? I mean, how did that even come to you as a possible occupation?
My mother wrote poems, and just sort of for fun, sort of poems about, I'll write you a poem if you'll all like be quiet for an hour.
Really?
And so instead of being spanked or something, we'd sit there and it would be as if we were sitting for a portrait, and she'd say, "I'm going to write about you." And sometimes she would fall asleep, but she'd say, "I will seem as if I'm falling asleep, but I'm thinking. And it was sort of, I think, her secret way to get a nap in, and we would just watch her.
Nice.
So we had poetry books, children's poetry around.
Right.
She was big on that.
This was when you were very young.
Yeah.
But as you became older, it became a possibility, the potential of being a poet.
Only in the sense of, no, I mean, I wrote in high school the kinds of poems everyone writes, I think. I hate my parents, I hate love, all of that. Bad stuff. And then when I went off to college, my mother gave me a copy of Sylvia Plath's Ariel. about which she knew nothing. She just thought, this seems like a poetry book, and I'll give it to you so you can start thinking about poetry when you go to college. And I found it very life-changing to read that. I'd never read any poet who just wrote that rawly. And of course, I proceeded to write poems that were raw and horrible. But at least I thought of the idea of writing as something you could take seriously. But even then, I wanted to be a veterinarian.
Really?
Yeah, that was
I
my.
never heard that.
Yeah, that was my lifelong goal.
There is a tradition of doctor poets, of course,
Yeah.
but not veterinary poets.
No, I could have started
You
something.
would have been it, yeah. When I was in school, my professors were older. They were still new critics. That is, they thought they wanted to avoid what was called the intentional fallacy, that the poem should just be read for what's there on the page, that you shouldn't consider what the author intended because that was unknowable, biography, all that was to be excluded. In 2004, you published a very interesting essay called Boon and Burden. Let me just read you a passage from it. In an age in which an author's photographs and the author's private life get as much play as the author's writing, it becomes increasingly more difficult to come upon a poem without bringing to our assessment of it what we know about the author's identity. But ultimately, it should be the identity of the poem, not the poet, that matters.
That book was cranky.
It's a brilliant essay. I love the way it begins, too. He describes giving his students a poem, they start to critique it. And then as they're critiquing it, he keeps feeding them information about Langston Hughes. And their impression of the poem and what it means keeps shifting around to accommodate what he's telling them, as though the poem itself were changing. Is that possible, though? I mean, can the poem be divorced from its creator?
Well, I think it can. I think it can be read both ways. I mean, I certainly have read poems by people whose lives I know nothing about.
Right.
So it's got to be possible to appreciate a poem in that way. And then it can be useful to know some more, to know what was behind a poem. But sometimes I think it can overshadow it, and as has happened with Plath a lot. And I think that becomes an unfairness to the poem. And also, then it works in the reverse way, that I think people think then that whatever art there is to poetry, that it is simply a business of extracting personal information and figuring out how to arrange it on the page. And it leads to people also despairing. I have students who will despair because they feel their lives aren't tragic enough and dramatic enough. I don't think that has to be
That
the source of everything.
The poem is not just encoded biography.
Right, right. So,
Your essay also made me realize that it's not a burden shared equally among poets. I mean, no one would describe Ted Kooser as, oh, the great straight white poet.
right.
It is a burden that minorities bear.
Yeah, I feel there's more of a pressure. First of all, there's an expectation that you're going to write a certain way.
Yes.
Then there's a pressure sometimes from fellow people within that minority to write a certain way. And one of the questions I used to get a lot more often was, why did you stop writing black poetry? And they
What do
said,
they mean by that?
they meant that in my first book, there were a few poems where there were identifiably black figures.
Yes.
And after that, I guess, they say, well, now the poems are about sex and, nature, morality. I think, well, that's not
Non-black subjects. Yes.
That seems pertinent to everybody. So, but this idea that you're not somehow representing, but representing whom, I think is a frustrating kind of pressure that is put on people, various minorities, but also,
Would you read one of those
that was
poems
kind of
now?
a rambling
No,
sentence.
no,
that
it's
I
right
just
to the
used.
question.
Just stop me.
In your first book, In the Blood, you write one of those poems called Passing.
Yeah, I know. That's a
Would you read
poem
that poem?
that was the problem. Okay, passing. When the famous black poet speaks, I understand that his is the same unnervingly slow, rambling method of getting from A to B that I hated in my father who always told me, don't shuffle. The famous black poet is speaking of the dark river in the mind that runs thick with the heroes of color, Jackie R., Bessie, Billy, Mr. Page, anyone who knew how to sing or when to run. I think of my grandmother, said to have dropped dead from the evil eye, of my lesbian aunt who saw cancer and a generally difficult future headed her way in the still water of her brother's commode. I think of voodoo in the bottoms of soup cans, and I want to tell the poet that the blues is not my name, that Alabama is something I cannot use in my business. He is so like my father. I don't ask the famous black poet afterwards to remove his shoes, knowing the inexplicable black and pink I will find there, a cut gone wrong in 5 places. I don't ask him to remove his pants, since that too is known, what is never known a blade, all the spaces between, where we differ. I have spent years tugging between my legs and proved nothing really. I wake to the sheets I kicked aside and examine where they failed to mend their own creases, resembling some silken obstruction, something pulled from my father's chest, a bad heart, a lung, the lung of the famous black poet, saying nothing I want to understand. That's cranky too.
It is.
But
20 years
meant.
ago, more than 20 years ago.
Yeah, it's a long time ago. Yeah. After going to a poetry reading. See,
Yeah.
things do come from actual life. There really was a famous black poet giving a reading.
Would you tell us who it was?
No. He's still alive.
Okay. All right. But the irony, of course, now is that you are a famous.
I know, as soon as I read that, I thought that was kind of funny.
Yeah.
But, you know. But I don't usually think of myself that way.
As a famous black poet. Well,
Or
no.
like even any famous poet, you know. That would be kind of obnoxious.
Yeah,
Here I am, I'm walking my dog, I'm the famous
Famous
black poet.
This is his dog.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Part of that, the title of that essay is boon. What's the boon of that? I saw the burden clearly, but
Yeah. That's a good question. I must have gotten the title from something. Well,
I've read it
probably.
more recently than you have.
I don't know. I don't know if I address it in that essay, but I guess I think that it seemed to me, especially when my first book was published, it was published the same year as Timothy Liu's first book and Rafael Campos. And so we were kind of like the gay ethnic trio, musketeers. We were always like reading together, it seemed. And it did seem as if there was a certain kind of boon to having an identity that you could write from that people seemed to think was interesting to hear about. But then at the same time, I can see how that can be a burden to you as well. Right. So yeah, it's something different, but not if you get sort of marketed that way and compartmentalized in that way.
Right. You said in your first book, or you said of your first book, In the Blood, it outed you as a gay man.
Yeah.
Just a funny way of saying it.
Mm.
But it didn't really, did it?
Kind of.
Really?
Mm.
There were people you knew who didn't know you were gay, who discovered it through that book.
Kind of.
Huh.
Yeah. Well, I was married.
To a woman.
Yes, at the time when I was writing those poems, and had was very confused about the whole thing. And see, this is one of those unexpected questions. So I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't have gotten married knowing I was gay, but it was a very different time period. And then being raised on Air Force bases, it wasn't the kind of climate now where, you know, I know people who say at 5, they came out to their parents and they were embraced and loved for it, which is great, but that wasn't my experience. And so I was writing these poems and then sent them off to a contest. And before I heard about the contest, I had moved with my wife up to Boston. I returned to graduate school. And I met a guy on the street and fell in love with him. And within days of that, told her about that and got a phone call that book had been chosen to be published as part of this first book contest. And it was all weird, to say the least.
Your wife had not read the poems.
She had, and that's the thing. She had, and so that's the thing too. I didn't think of these poems as being like gay poems.
No, they don't seem
whatever
very
those
explicit.
might be. And she, would give me advice about them and feedback. And then Rachel Haddis, who had been the judge for the contest, they sent me her introduction. They said, we just want you to see what she wrote. And in there, she says that she doesn't know who this poet is, but he must be a poet of color, erotically attracted to other men. And I thought, huh. And then that's that part of the introduction is what they put on the back of the book for the bird. And so, a lot of people apparently didn't know. Of course, there were all the other people who said, we knew all the time. Yeah. We never understood what your problem was. So,
You have wonderful poems about the difficulty and the challenges of sexual desire in general. One of your poems ends with the question, why do we love at all? It's such a painful question in that poem. In another poem you write, they'd confused pleasure with the making of pleasure, the way others mistake exactness of composition for perfection and call it art. Such a great line.
why, thank you.
And it raises another fascinating issue in your verse, the difficulty of depicting sexual experience in language. I wonder if you'd read Youth with Satyr.
Huh. Yes.
You're uncomfortable reading that.
No, I will. I was just thinking, what is that poem? And now I see. Youth with Satyr, both resting. There are certain words, ecstasy, abandon, surrender. We can wait all our lives sometimes, not so much to use as to use correctly. Then the moment at last comes, the right scene, but more impossibly different than any we'd earlier imagined, and we stumble, catching instead at nouns like desire that could as easily be verbs, unstable adjectives like rapt or unseemly. We find that for once, nothing at hand serves quite as well as the finger doing what it does, pointing at the wine whose slim remains the two glasses, tipped slightly, given over to the grass as to their own sweet brand of longing, look like any moment letting go of, or the boy's hand fallen in such a way as to just miss touching the predictably stiff phallus, no other word here will do, of the satyr, or at how the O of the boy's mouth, barely open, is the same O that the satyr's beard, abruptly arching away from his shag-covered chest and on, skyward, seems most like wanting to curl into, if only it could, which in turn is the same O repeated by those the grape's twisting vines, too artificially perhaps, string above and to either side of the two sleepers in the manner of any number of unresolvable themes let dangle. That's a mouthful.
It's just great.
But it's syntactically over the top. I think that's what I was thinking. That's from the second book. Yeah. And I thought that was kind of, wow, how long can I make this last?
It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating.
Well, thanks.
Having spent, I guess, decades
Yeah.
denying or misrepresenting your sexuality, perhaps even to yourself, is it still difficult to get over that barrier to speak explicitly about sexual experience?
No, I feel like, and I don't feel like there was a difficulty. It wasn't a willful suppression. I feel as if the moment I understood it, I came out and that was the end of it. And then, if anything, especially I found this moving to St. Louis, I apparently seem very radical and, liable to say anything and constantly shocking people.
St. Louis.
It is St. Louis. But you're from St. Louis, so I didn't want to say that. But no, no, I find that it's very, not only easy, but necessary. I feel,
Necessary.
to speak honestly about who you are and to speak honestly about desire, not to convert anybody, but I think it would have been helpful to me had I had teachers or writings or something available where I could think, oh, this exists too, and doesn't seem to be something tawdry or to be run away from necessarily.
Right.
So, yeah, I think it's important to be open.
Could you read a poem in there called King of Hearts?
Is that where the other marker thing is? Yeah.
It's on page 10.
Thank you. How'd you know page 10? King of Hearts. No, because the other thing is that it's more graphic. This book is more graphic than all the others, so I think, because then I thought, oh, say everything.
Yes.
Now I think that it's much sexier to be subtle.
Yes.
So, King of Hearts. Somewhere now, someone is missing him, since here he is for the taking, nicked at 3 of his 4 corners, decked out in the fade of much play, his 2 heads laid prone on the sidewalk before you. Like you, in this heat and humidity, no wind when it comes moves him. Like you, he knows a thing maybe about wilting, how, like sleep or some particularly miserable defeat played over, but this time in slow motion, it has its own fine beauty. Tonight, once you've found him, when you've brought him home, the man with a face as close as you'll ever get to the other one, the one it was easy enough earlier not to pick up, to step on even, and move slowly but unbothered away from, you'll only remember the part about wilting. And even that, as you lift his ass toward you, as your hands spread it open until it resembles nothing so much as a raw heart, but with a seemingly endless hole through it, even that will fade. Him, between drink and the good money you've paid, doing whatever you tell him. Him throwing back whatever words you hand out. You're the king. You're the king. Him saying. That was actually a researched poem, if you'd like to know. I mean, there was a randomness of finding an actual King of Hearts on the ground in Boston. Mm-hmm. But I also, the guy who I mentioned earlier, I fell in love with, ended up being my partner for 18 years. And during that period, I met some of his friends, and one of them was a guy who was constantly talking about picking up prostitutes, male prostitutes in Boston. And because this is the kind of thing I did back then, I said, what's a male prostitute? Where do you see them? What do they look like? So they said, you want to go on a field trip? So we went and like at 2 a.m. to the bus station, because I thought, well, I was amazed that they existed. And there they were, and strung out and fine, so that was the end of the research. But it led me to think about this whole idea of what does it mean to bring somebody home, pay them, and, I wouldn't have gotten that without research. Lest I not seem scholarly.
One of your poems says, language should be and is flexible. It recalls in this way morality, how there's nothing, it seems, not to be given into. Such a marvelously ironic observation. Can you unpack that?
I believe in flexible morality. I think the problem with morality, the reason that it gets a bad name is because it's usually associated with inflexibility. And so this is right, this is wrong. When I feel as if there's a lot more room for, in the same way, for example, that we've seen just in the last, 10, 20 years, so many new definitions of what family means. Well, that's an example to me. There's the traditional moral idea of what a good family is, but now it could be a number of things. And
but all those families would be loving and supportive, wouldn't they? None of them. No.
Well, they should be.
I mean, all those good families should be loving and supportive.
Yes, they should be. But I think this dysfunction can exist in any kind of family, and probably does. But the idea that there should be room for, if you want to be a dysfunctional family, why does it have to be man, woman, and 2.5 children? Right. In that sense, I think that the inflexibility of morality is what leads people to so much difficulty, whether it's not being able to come out, whether it's people who throw themselves off a bridge because they're afraid of being exposed as gay, all kinds of horrible things that happen. But the difficulty is that if there's too much flexibility, then there's no morality, and there have to be some kind of rules, I suppose. And even with people I know who are in open relationships. But even then, when you try to pin it down, they don't mean open, you can have 300 lovers. They seem to have this idea of, well, maybe like we'll be open, but we'll talk about it, or something. Even then they try to impose rules. I think we don't feel good without rules.
Right. There's sometimes a deep sadness mingled in these sexual encounters in the poems, as though the experience of pleasure reminds one of the eventual loss of the body.
Yeah.
I wonder if you'd read a poem called The Kill.
Yeah. Thanks. The Kill. The last time I gave my body up to you, I was minded briefly what it is made of, what yours is, that I'd forgotten, the flesh, which always I hold in plenty, no little sorrow for, because, oh, do but think on its predicament and weep. We cleave most entirely to what most we fear losing. We fear loss because we understand the fact of it, its largeness, its utter indifference to whether we do or don't ignore it. By then, you were upon me, and then in me. Soon the tokens I almost never can let go of, I'd again begin to, and would not miss them. The swan unfolding upward less on trust than because simply that's what it does, and the leaves leaving, a single arrow held back in the merciless patience which, in taking aim, is everything. And last, as from a grove in flame toward any air more clear, the stag, but this time its bent head a chandelier, rushing for me, like some undisavowable distraction. I looked back, and instead of you, saw the soul at labor to break its bonds that you'd become. I tensed my bow, one animal at attack, the other one suffering, and love would out all suffering.
Very sad and moving love poem.
I'm glad you think of it as a love poem. I do. I was just explaining to someone just yesterday, relatively young someone, about, he was saying, don't you think that, do you really believe that all relationships have a shelf life? And I said, they do, if only because of mortality.
Yes.
And so
we have a shelf life.
yes, and I said, so, even if you stay with someone forever, somebody has to die first. And this seemed unacceptable
Which
to
is
him.
good. He should feel that's
Yes,
unacceptable.
I thought that was, it's unacceptable, but it must be accepted
Eventually.
and understood. And so I do think in some ways that as soon as it's not a new idea, as soon as we love anything. We were talking about dogs earlier. I ran 4 days after having lost my dog to get a new dog. But I thought, here I am, I've just committed to this loss that was only an abstraction before. But once you've actually lived with the dog and watched it actually die, then you know, okay, they really do die. And now I've got this other one I have to sort of love, but probably, I think I'll outlive him.
Yes.
Don't want to be mean, but I like to outlive my dog.
Yes, you probably will.
Since they don't live very long.
No.
Yeah.
What was your religious background?
I don't have one. I was
Your folks didn't go to church?
no. Well, they did apparently before I was born. My father is from Alabama, and he was Southern Baptist, and my mother was from London, England, and I guess technically was Church of England, but I don't think they did anything. Okay. Then I guess I was born because that's when they had this idea that, oh, maybe we should go to church because that's what families do or something. Yes. But they had just moved to this country from England where they met. And I guess they were treated prejudicially in the church. And so they decided, typical of how my parents think, therefore all churches are bad and evil. We will never set foot in a church again. It's a little extreme.
Yeah. But
they've always been that way. Restaurants, churches, it's the same. One bad experience, it's over. So as a result, I wasn't raised thinking of much of anything, but I feel as if what happened, I became sort of intellectually intrigued when I took a course on Milton's Paradise Lost.
In college.
Yeah, and you can't really understand it
No.
if you haven't, like,
You don't know the Bible.
if you don't know the Bible. And so constantly I had to look stuff up all the time. And I thought, what the hell? I'll read it. So, fine. And because it seemed important. And then I became really fascinated with the Old Testament in particular. And so I just like putzing around there and often get poetry ideas from it. I'll go through the book of Proverbs or something. I'll think that's an interesting word.
That
That's an interesting
completely
thought.
shocks me. Your poems are packed with religious language. I started to make a list, but I'd lost track.
They are, but if the closest I have ever gotten to anything like that is studying classics, and I'm fascinated with the Greek ideas about daimonic forces,
Right.
not so much Zeus and Hera, but the idea that everything is in some way infused with a divine force. And that idea is fascinating to me, but just intellectually.
You don't go to church.
No. I mean, as you know, I live 2 doors down from the gigantic basilica in St.
Right, it's a
Louis.
spectacular
So
cathedral.
I feel like maybe a little drifts over to my yard. And I hear the bells every hour,
It is lovely.
which are beautiful. I spend most of my time in my yard in the good weather, and the bells ring all the canonical
pray?
hours. No, just kind of. Well, see, I feel as if it depends. I feel that prayer is a number of things, and I think it can just be being in the natural world.
Yes, but in a Christian sense, reciting the Lord's Prayer, that sort of thing.
No.
You don't do.
No,
So
but I
surprising.
feel as if to go on a hike in the woods or just to sit, I have a
Right.
stand of bamboo in my backyard, just watching it wave in the wind seems somehow to me like a very spiritual experience.
I can see that in the poems, but this is why biographical criticism is so bad, because I would completely have misread you by reading the poems.
Well, isn't it great we're here? Get that all sorted out.
Now you're mocking me.
No. No, I just think it's...
There's-
But
there
you're
is
not
a
the first
tension.
one who's thought that. And many people have assumed I was raised Catholic. Many people think
Oh, I told my wife I didn't think so, but I couldn't quite tell.
Yeah, but no.
But there is a real tension that runs through the poems between faith and doubt.
Yes. And I'm very interested in the relationship between faith, devotion, and then sexual devotion.
Yes.
And I'm interested in faith when it comes to giving yourself up to something you don't have control of or maybe can't even see, like
Right.
a god or something, and then how that translates into the sexual arena. Whether it's like, say, in the sadomasochistic world of being bound and blindfolded and
Right.
giving yourself up to something you don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
That is a kind of faith too, that someone's not going to kill you.
Yes.
And
Well, the metaphysical poets played with those kind of weird sexual
Yeah.
religious imagery.
yeah, and I think that sex itself is, there's violation, gay or straight. There's penetration, and penetration is potential violation, and it's trust. So I am interested in how those things blur.
Some of your poems sound to me like someone who knows it would be a lot easier just to be an atheist, just to have that blind faith that God does not exist.
Right, I'm not like that.
No,
No.
you're more like Emily Dickinson. Kind of, there's a real fighting with
Yeah.
belief. A poem called
I kind of think the struggle, though, can be a form of religion.
Yes.
Just a kind of struggling to understand something.
Yes.
And maybe is more persuasive for me than someone just sort of saying, I believe. So
Right.
I'm attracted to poets like Dickinson or Hopkins or George Herbert who resist.
Yes.
They feel as if they should think something, but there's another part of them that says they don't want to.
Right. A poem of yours called The Gods, you write, "It is not that they don't exist, but that they are everywhere disguised, that no one space than another is less fit or more likely." In another poem, a wonderful poem, A Mathematics of Breathing, says, "The arched colonnades to a cathedral never quite meet any promised heaven. Instead, at their vaulted heights, falling down to an abrupt ending, base of the next column, smaller, the one smaller past that at last, dying, what is called perspective." So good.
Thank you. I wanted to say, that's pretty good, actually, but I didn't think I should say that. So.
And in Next Up, Arcadia, you say, there's a field nearby, stretch of field, like the one they say divides prayer from absolute defeat. That's essentially an Emily Dickinson moment. Faith doesn't sound comforting or easy in your poems at all.
No, but I guess I don't trust things that are easy.
Yes.
And I guess I think the things that are most valuable are often the things that are most fought for or hard won.
Right. Would you read a poem called Great Noise from the Devotions? There it is.
They look so strange without.
Oh, I know. This is your fault, you know. Why have you done this? Yeah, the Library of Congress has rebound these books blank.
Well, it keeps them nice and sturdy. Well, I mean, that part's good. Yeah, okay, a great noise. Then he died, and they said, another soul free, which was the wrong way to see it, I thought, having been there, having lain down beside him until his body became rigid with what I believe was not the stiffening of death, but of surprise, the initial unbelief of the suddenly ex-slave hearing rest, let it fall now, this burden. The proof most commonly put forth for the soul as a thing that exists and weighs something is that the body weighs something less after death, a clean fact. In the miraculous translation of the body of St. Catherine of Alexandria to Sinai, the number of angels required to bear the body all that way through the air comes to 4, which tells us nothing about weight or the lack of it, since the angels depicted are clearly those for whom the only business is hard labor. The work angels, you can tell, the musculature, the resigned way they wear clothes. Beyond them in rank, in the actual presence of God, the seraphim stand naked, ever burning, 6-winged, 2 to fly with, in back, 2 at the face to withstand the impossible winds that are God, and a 3rd pair for modesty, for the covering of sex. A great noise is said to always attend them, less the humming of wings than the grinding you'd expect from the hitching of what is hot, destructive, and all devotion to the highest, brightest star. It's arty, it's got that painting in it. I don't believe in including paintings in poems of mine now, but back then I wanted to say in the miraculous translation of the body of St. Catherine of Alexandria to Sinai. I thought to get that all in would be something.
Too long a line.
Oh.
This morning in the Washington Post, my colleague Michael Durder reviewed a work of cultural criticism by John Lack about the Midwest called The Lost Region. Maybe some of you read this review. It's basically a defense of the Midwest against East Coast snobbery. You were educated at Harvard.
Yes?
You're a Yale Younger Poets judge. You have every right to be an East Coast snob. But you live in St. Louis.
Yeah.
How did you find moving to St. Louis?
I liked it from the beginning.
It's very different than the East Coast.
Yeah, I mean, I think partly I liked that I didn't know anyone, and I had felt it was time to get out of Boston. But also, I took it on as a kind of tourist, and just started doing all these things that no one seems to do who actually lives there. Okay. So I went to the Merrimack Caverns.
Yeah, that's cool.
You know, all these different, cheesy things.
Cahokia Mounds.
Yes, Cahokia Mounds, the wineries, and, get drunk in Herman on a bus, and all the things you're supposed to do. And it was interesting because I moved there with my then partner who very much disliked it, and very much because it wasn't Boston and the landscape was different. And that's when I started thinking that maybe there was a problem with New England in some ways. That I thought I can see how you could say this isn't Boston, but it is something else.
Yes.
And it could be exciting to find out what it is.
What surprised you about the Midwest?
I very much like the landscape, not St. Louis so much, but driving out into the fields and the huge skies. I mean, it seems very, I don't know, stereotypical to praise them, but they are very
It is
huge.
awesome.
And when you're not used to seeing a sky, and also there's a way in which, at first, I went there thinking that people were more narrow-minded, and they may be, but I think if they are more likely to leave everyone alone. And so they have their opinions, but they don't share them. And there's a way in which it's live and let live, and I kind of have come to appreciate that as a Midwest thing. It's not the Midwest kindness that you see in Minnesota, for example. It's just more, I don't know. St. Louis has a strange, to me, though I've learned not to say this in St. Louis, it's more like a southern kind of state. It's kind of this weird thing going. And so there's a lot of redneck pride to some extent. And yet, I find that many of those people can be friends and are much more open-minded than I would think. Whereas in Boston, I experienced in Boston much more racism. And maybe in part because in Boston, it's possible to go around and not even see a black community. It's very much sectioned off. Whereas in St. Louis, everyone's there. You see it all, and I think that's healthy. It's useful to know that there are different kinds of people, and so it makes people maybe differently tolerant.
How does place or location play in your poems?
It plays a lot, but what I find interesting is that more often, even after 20 years in St. Louis, I'm more likely to have an ocean. It's more likely to be that kind of. But I think that might have to do with.
Or ponds. There were ponds.
Yeah.
But the Mississippi River, I did not sense in your poems.
I know, and actually,
It's an awesome river.
it is. It is.
It is.
I guess I only have seen the part that's right there in St.
Down.
Louis, and that's not very awesome.
You have to go up by Alton, by the cliffs and the bluffs.
Yeah, well, I've seen that. That is actually impressive, yes. Where the eagles nest.
Could we have a moment?
No, it is. I don't know why the river doesn't figure into it more often. Part of it is, as soon as I got to St. Louis, all I could think of with the river was slavery. That's what I think of with the Mississippi River. It's how slaves get transported.
Right.
And then there's St. Louis with the Dred Scott decision. The
Right.
court is right there.
Yes.
So it's got a different feeling for me. It doesn't immediately leap up as free of connotation,
Right.
in the way that the ocean is for me. Even though I know slaves had to come across the ocean
Passage.
too, but I know, but they weren't at Cape Cod.
No.
That was a different part of the ocean.
Right.
So
Right.
I don't know how I justify it. The landscape is important, and more the Midwest landscape is, but it's more likely to be fields. I mean, it can't be an ocean. It's
Right.
not likely to be a river.
Right. There's frequently a kind of transcendental quality to the treatment of nature in your natural world. I wonder if you'd read a poem called Speak Low. It's your title poem here.
Yeah, that was a challenge poem for myself.
What is a challenge poem?
Well, once in a while when I can't write, I try to make myself come up with something that I resist doing,
Yes?
and so that becomes the rule. And so the whole idea was there could be no people. No people, and there could be no sex. And towards the end, there's a little bit of people, I suppose, but basically. So that was the idea, just landscape.
Okay.
Speak low. The wind stirred. The water beneath it stirred accordingly. The wind's pattern was its own, and the water's also. The water in that sense was the wind's reflection. The wind was to the water what the water was to the light that fell there, or appeared to fall, spilling as if the light were a liquid, or as if the light and the water it spilled across were now the same. It is true that the light, like the water, assumed the pattern of what acted upon it, but the water assumed also the shape of what contained it, while the light did not. The light seemed fugitive, a restiveness, the less than clear distance between everything we know we should do, and all the rest that we do. Stirring as the wind stirred it, the water, was a form of clarity itself, a window we've no sooner looked through than we've abandoned it for what lies past that, a view, and then what comes into view, or might, if we watch patiently enough, steadily, so we believe, wishing for what by now even we can't put a name to, but feel certain we'll recognize, having done so before. It looked, didn't it, just like harmlessness, a small wind, some light on water. So I wanted it to be all landscape, but I wanted it to talk about this idea of things that, of longing for something just past what you have, and it seems harmless enough, but will turn out to actually cause damage, as a way of really talking about desire. But there were no people in it.
Right.
But there's we, but it was just the kind of academic we.
It's not an academic poem.
No.
It's hard not to think about Walden Pond, though, and the way Thoreau writes about the light on the water and the
Yeah.
wind on the water.
Sure.
A field of water betrays the spirit that is in the air. It is continually receiving new life and motion from above. It's very similar to
Yes.
the spirit of what you're saying.
Yeah.
I was amazed at how often your treatment of nature so often soars into something suddenly very different. I wonder if you'd read Distortion.
Uh-huh.
What?
No, because that does soar into something different. I know. Distortion. Having opened to their fullest, they opened further. Now the peonies, near to breaking, splay groundward. Some even touch the ground. And though I do understand, yes, that they're not the not-so-lovely after all example of how excess, even in its smallest forms, seems to have its cost, I think it anyway. I even think they look more than a little bit like rough sex once it's gone where, of course, it had to. Do you know what I mean? His smell on you after. Like those parts of the gutted deer that the men bring home with them fresh from the hunt, as if you were like that now, the parts, not the smell. I mean, as if you were his, all you'd ever wanted to be, and how you almost believe that. Do you see that too? According to Augustine, it's a distortion of the will that leads to passion, a slavish obedience to passion that leads to habit, until habit in turn becomes hunger, a need. What is it about logic, when delivered unflinchingly, that makes a thought like that sound true, whether true or not? Significant of nothing but a wind that, rising suddenly, falls as suddenly again back, the trees swing briefly in the same direction, as if I couldn't quite admit yet to a kind of grace in synchronicity, and had asked for proof, and the trees were one part of it, another the light at this late afternoon hour when it works both against and in the body's favor, like camouflage, which in the end is only distortion by a prettier name. I know all about that. You can call it heartlessness, an indifference to ruin, a willed inability to be surprised by it. You'd be mistaken. Don't go. Let me show you what it looks like when surrender and an instinct not to run side by side. But yeah, the rough sex. And you know what's problematic about this, about being me, is that I was actually, not that I liked sharing such biography, but I was actually just dealing with some peonies that flopped out of shape in the garden.
Yes.
And then I don't know what makes me think they're like rough sex.
Yes.
I don't know why that happens.
There is something lurid about peonies.
There is, but who thinks that while they're in their garden?
Well, they're all going to think it now.
It just seems...
You pretty much ruined the peony hedge.
I don't know, it just seems strange, and you think, oh, okay, and then it goes on down that path, and then I'm running in the house trying to write it down.
Right.
And think, this could be interesting.
It is.
Oh.
It's a tough poem to stay with you. Who is that you address?
I don't know, but I do know that in some review, they wrote about that poem in particular, and they said, oh yeah, well, and then there's a point after that where Phillips turns to us and says, do you know what I mean? Well, no, we don't.
Oh.
And I thought, okay, well, learn a little. You know, think about it. And Augustine's in there. I think that gives it a little
Considerable.
So-
Because it's one of your poems that bears rereading. They all bear rereading. I mean,
I know what you mean. It's like hard to
gives
take
more
in.
as you read it. Yes, it is hard to
It's
stay
a little
with it as it
dense.
Horses, bees, particularly
Yeah.
wasps, flowers, trees. These elements appear again and again in your poems. Why is that?
Partly, bees and wasps seem to constantly be around, and
What is it with you and the bees?
I don't.
And Nick Flynn too with the bees.
Actually, we have a little bond about that.
About the bees?
Yeah,
You
but
wrote a whole book about the bees.
I know.
It's a really weird collection.
It is.
I loved it.
I love it too, but
Blind beekeeper in France.
well, he really existed.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the way to do it. I mean, it's seeing them that throws me into a panic.
Really? Are you allergic?
I'm apparently allergic to them, but I've never been stung. So I don't know. So then I think, oh, and I'm only supposed to have an EpiPen around, but I think that's unmanly in some way. So I don't carry it around because I'm tough and I'd rather die of a bee sting. Not very manly at all.
You're a poet tending your peonies, worrying about being manly.
Mm.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, I've got my hands in the dirt.
Okay. All right. No, but why these elements? The bees, the wasps, the horses in particular show up again and again.
Well, horses fascinate me because they seem, and I think from D.H. Lawrence, they seem so sexual
Yes.
and so powerful, and this impulse to tame them.
Yes.
But to me, what's exciting, I've not ridden a horse very often in my life because I'm very afraid of them, actually. But when I've been on one, there's something that feels like power, but then knowing that this thing could kill you,
Yes.
whether throwing you or stampeding or whatever. And I've seen them bite people. And, I mean, it's been horrible. So, but there's something, to me, attractive about what's dangerous and trying to see how close you can get to it and how much can you contain it. I mean, I would even say that I think relationships sometimes can be fascinating in this way. Not that, I mean, no one wants to be in a destructive relationship, but I can see why people are sometimes. There's something to fight against. And bees a little less so. Bees just seem, there's something magical about them to me, and I think maybe that comes from things like Virgil, the Georgics, and those myths about bees coming out of ox bodies and magically, and I'm not the first person to be fascinated with how they're societal insects, and that's interesting, hierarchies of power.
Right.
So, yeah.
Very interesting.
But I don't like bees or horses. And that's what's interesting, because people have asked me if I ride, or someone asked me if I did falconing, because I have hawks and falcons. I'm terrified of birds like that. And most birds are filthy.
I did notice a lot about horses, though.
Yeah.
In July, a man named Mark Edmondson published a Jeremiah in Harper's. Did you read that?
Mm-mm.
It was called The Death of Poetry.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I read parts of it on Poetry Daily. They put
Okay.
it on.
Yeah. He said our modern poets are oblique, equivocal, painfully self-questioning, timid, small, in retreat, ever more private, idiosyncratic, and withdrawn. That's
Right.
a pretty standard critique of modern poetry from people who don't like it. As a teacher of poetry and as a poet, how do you respond to that sort of general criticism of dismissal of modern contemporary poetry?
Well, the thing is, it's not really true, because I can think of so many poets already who write differently from that. Yes, there are poets who are writing obliquely. Perhaps I might be among them sometimes, or people who write from what seems like very much the self. But then there are other people who are writing. I mean, you had Elizabeth Alexander on this series, as part of this series, and she writes about history a lot, and from the persona of various people in time. So that's, I guess I just don't think it's true. That what I read of that article, suggested that he just had an axe to grind about a particular kind of poetry, which has always existed. And then I don't think even, I mean, I don't know. I think, first of all, I think all poetry is at some level autobiographical. And I guess I want to believe that for my own poems, yes, there may be an I. It doesn't mean it's me. And I guess I'm hoping that there will be readers who will relate to the poems in the way that I've related to poems by people such as Sylvia Plath. But I'm not Sylvia Plath, and I didn't have her story. And yet, they're about so much more than one person's life. They seem to me to be about vulnerability and questioning and doubt and feelings of insecurity. That's just a human poem. Right. So I think it seemed a little silly.
It did. I'm sorry to bring it up.
No, because
But I
that
wanted
gave
to
me
get
a chance to speak against it.
Exactly. That's what I was trying to elicit. Thank you for taking it that way. You once said to an interview that I've always been a reader of the Tang Dynasty poets and longed for that brevity that didn't have to compromise resonance. That brevity that doesn't have to compromise resonance. What do you mean by that?
Well, because those poems of the Tang Dynasty poets, people like Li Po and Du Fu, are very short, but I find I can read one and linger for a long time over it, and I value very much how you can. It seems to me to have a lot to do with image, and so a small cluster of images can set so many different kinds of thoughts into motion, and I value that as opposed to having to always sit and explain the thought. Even though I like syntax and I like extended sentences and metaphors, but I find more and more that the poems I write are much shorter, and I'd like to, I don't know, I mean, I'm not going to try to be a Tang Dynasty poet, but I think that resonance can really happen when there's compression.
Right. That's the magic.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which can happen in a long poem, too. Just, it's not going to happen all the time.
Right. You have a poem called Brocade. Could you read those lines?
I speak because I can speak, making distinctions because between to know and to understand, there is still a difference, I tell myself. I sing as I can, softly. Large print.
Yeah.
I like
So
that.
I don't have to.
No, I like
explain
that.
as I
Yeah,
read you.
I can see it.
That's so nice. There's a distinction between to know and to understand. That's where your poem is trying to get into that crack and widen that for us.
Yeah, because there's a lot we know, and then there's a lot we don't understand.
Right.
And I think many people are content just to know.
Yes. Yeah. In a poem called Civilization, you write, "There's an art to everything. It must only look like leaving. Now it's time for us to leave. But it must only look like leaving."
That was a very good segue.
Isn't that good? My wife thought that was good too. Because we're going to go across the hall to a little reception. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I just really enjoyed this.
Thank you. Thanks.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.